All right, so I think we are ready to begin. My name is Deanna Christensen. I am the AIA Minnesota Continuing Education Director, and we welcome you to our second of 3 mini code updates that we've been able to present to you with support from our Building Codes Knowledge community, and thanks to Gerhard Guth, who volunteered to present these to our membership. If you were with us last week, you will have already heard this, but as a reminder, you should all be muted, and we ask you to remain muted throughout the session. We also ask you to not show your video so that we can reserve bandwidth for the PowerPoint. If you have questions, please enter those in the chat box, and Gerhard will do his best to answer as many of those questions during the webinar or at the end. If you are an AIA member, credits will be recorded to your transcript, and you all will receive certificates provided you've been with us for the entire hour. And since we only have 1 hour and lots to cover, I'm going to quickly introduce Gerhard and then turn it over to him. Gerhard is the Senior Specifier and Code Specialist at HGA here in Minneapolis. He is the co-chair of the AIA Minnesota Building Codes Knowledge Community, and he's an active member in the local CSI chapter. He served on many state committees, lending the architect's vision and expertise to code development and adoption. Gerhard, thank you. And with that, it's all yours.
All right, thank you so much, Deanna. So welcome all. If it's your first time, great to have you. And if you're able to join us from the first session, welcome back. This will be, as Deanna said, our second of 3 sessions. The third one will be on the ADA, yet to be presented next Wednesday. So without further ado, there are a lot of slides in here. I will be providing, or we have made some updates. I've made some updates since the session that, or PDF that Deanna just sent you out this morning. So if you are like to see that version just slightly tweaked, certainly that will be available to all those who are attending today's session. So just a kind of a quick review of the today's intent is to show you a kind of a high level version of what is currently being that is effective within the state of Minnesota. I took the liberty of using Greg Metz's presentation, which he has given, and some of you, probably many of you, hopefully have had an opportunity to see this at some point. And he will probably be presenting a newer version of it, but that's yet to be determined when they're going to get back in the circuit, in the speaking circuit to get this out. So I've made some notes, marked up a few things, taking on what he had presented back way back when, and well, without further ado, let's go through this and see as much as we can get in. I will probably skip through some things that I find to be more specific to certain project scope. There again, as I said, you have access to this version, and by all means, as probably goes without saying, the code book is your #1 source. Regardless of what I talk about or what Greg mentions here, these are just overviews. Please get a copy of that at your earliest convenience. They are available online as well as hard copy, which has all the Minnesota amendments embedded within the 2018 IBC. So modifications in red, as it says right here. All right, this probably goes without saying. Information is here. He may have had a combination in his talk that included the 1311, which is what we talked about last week. So I've just struck that out because we're not talking about that today. Proposed rules, yes, obviously updated since then. You can see the place here where one goes on the Dolly website to get access to this information. This and all the other chapters that are currently effective. And just a quick reminder of what transpired last week in the conversation. There's the NEC is still yetting to be vetted. There's 25 or more folks there that we're looking to request some questions or answers questions from the law judge. So that has yet to be effective. So you're still into the old code for that, the older code for the electric code. Elevator code is still some things they're tweaking, and plumbing code, still the old code for that as well, up until whenever that's determined. And that's pretty much about it. But go to the website and you will certainly see the information on that, on what's current and what is yet to be issued. So just kind of a quick summary of the advisory group that I was involved in. Unlike the 1311, I didn't get a chance to be part of that. There's only so many things you can do in a day or in the time that you have available. But I was part of this group with Greg as the chairperson. There were others involved. Jerry Norman, as you may remember that name from the past, he was part of the group, and there was probably 5 or 6 of us. The tag committees, the technical advisory groups, are set up for all the chapters, and anyone is welcome to submit a request to be part of these sessions, and I have some more slides on that. But just know that it's an open forum. It isn't intended to be closed door. Anyone can go to these sessions. Even if you're not in the committee itself, you're certainly welcome to attend them and ask questions along the way. But it is intended not to be, it's intended to be transparent and not to be done in a closed door concept. Having said that, there are a lot of things that need to be done to get the process completed. And as you can see here in this, I think we talked about this last week too, you can see there's a myriad of different items and groups that are involved in the process. Uh, some of you might have had some questions pertaining to that hard date, as opposed to having it as a time period for 6 months grace period. I will say that you need to talk to your AHJ, because every municipality may have a different version or understanding of what that is. The state has given some latitude to this. Officially, I'm not sure if it's official, but there was some talk about the fact of, because of COVID-19, that there would be a little bit of a slide in that effective date for certain project types. And it all depends on where you are in your design process, whether you're in DD or in CDs or somewhere else. So please talk to your AHJ about that to be sure you're all on the same page. Okay, these are the rules. I'm not going to get too much into this. This is really just something that Greg wants to let everyone know what's a statute, what's a rule. You can certainly read this on your spare time that you have. But the process is that we are in a rulemaking format, and this is how we develop the codes as they are. So there's some wordsmithing. He talks about the amendment, the repeal process, add, modify, delete. We did do a fairly exhaustive look at the code because we do only adopt every 6 years. 15 was basically a skip year, just like 2021 will be a skip year. So we need to then, when we're looking at the next code cycle, as an example, 2024, we'll be looking at 2021, how it compares to 2018, which is what we did adopt, and then amend the 2024 based on 2 code cycles. So just know that it isn't as simple as just, if there is anything simple about code, taking information and modifying it to fit the needs of the state of Minnesota and its constituents, but it's also looking at what the previous codes were requiring and what they amended in the code cycles that we're skipping. So here's something to just keep in mind. Next code cycle is 2026. You can see the tag committees are forming in January 2024. And with that, the proposals are submitted and there's a whole process, and you could saw the flow chart that I had shown earlier. And it becomes like a 2-year process from start to end. And I know folks have said to me in the past, why does it take so long? Well, you could see as the flow chart shows, there's a lengthy pecking order of things that need to happen. And then if the legislature gets involved, that's a whole nother can of worms. And right now there's some talk about that, but at this point, we're still doing what we're doing. It's an effective code, and all the chapters that are part of that building code are still very much in play. Okay, so I just reiterated again, here again, you'll have copies of this, so you certainly can always refer back to it, but this is where you find all those codes. And if anything else, if nothing else, as a takeaway, just go to this, and this will give you all the links to all the different codes that are effective, or I should say are printed and or effective, where you can get them online, and then also where you can order them through the ICC. Okay, so one of the things that Greg wanted to bring up in our code as we have it right now, there are some provisions done in Chapter 3. So 3.0 occupancy classification and use, and I'm looking at my hard copy on the side here, is my little cheat book. But one thing I would want the group to know more than anything else in this, without getting into the details of it, is that Minnesota, because of the development of certification and licensure, we as a group had talked about the challenges that all the teams have when it comes to understanding the nuances of what is a care facility and under what jurisdiction is it under. So the state had chosen to provide a table, and it's not listed here, but it's 302.2 that is specific to Minnesota, and it is talking about every single facility, licensed facility, in the care recipients and the IBC occupancy classification. And it is a fairly lengthy table. It's actually almost 3 pages long in its entirety. And the intent there is because of the confusion that comes with these kind of facilities, to help the architectural community understand what the jurisdiction is and who to go to for information. It's listing it in a table. So hopefully the AIA members can appreciate the work that was done to hopefully clarify and give some good guidance moving forward. So I just mentioned a couple of things here that Greg had started with different conditions. Again, these are all in the code. Just be aware that, you know, these are Minnesota. Some of these things are IBC version, and some of them are amended in Minnesota. And of course, you can tell by looking into the code book, if there's a dark bar on the side, that's a change from the last code cycle, which in this case, we didn't adopt the 2015 IBC. However, then Minnesota has its provisions that are done in the margin that has MN next to it. And some of these things, as I've mentioned here, descriptions for an R4, boarding care homes, housing with service establishment, residential, and then similar things going on for the I1s. So without getting into the detail of it, these are the things that have been changed or modified to bring some more clarification to these specific group occupancies. So it's really just talking about conditions, what are the conditions, and then of course some clarifications or some updates to those conditions for the, in this case would be I believe the I1, condition 1. And then there's a condition 2, talking about memory care facilities and what the specific criteria would be based on this condition. So again, without getting into the details of it, find that in that chapter. So this is where I was getting at it with the table. What about memory care, DHS license, MDH license, all the things that those of you who do work in this realm with this type of group occupancy, you're probably very well aware of the nuances that are needed to understand when you're designing for these spaces. So just know that there are a number of things that we tried to do as a state to clarify the conditions. And it talks about the condition 2 requirements, the minimums, in this case, for smoke compartments, travel distances, refuge areas. Keep in mind, I wanted to point out that there again, when it comes to sprinkling, unless you're dealing with a residential type group occupancy, which is in another code, the residential code, if you're dealing with the commercial code, generally speaking, the Nfpa 13 is the sprinkling, which is basically a fully sprinkled building as opposed to a partially sprinkled building, such as a 13R. So some of these things can be permitted, but generally speaking, it's usually when you're dealing with a 13 that you're going to be able to get those specific criteria. And then existing facilities, really talking about what's involved in those type of situations. You may find yourself actually looking at, because it's an existing, depending on the nature of what's involved, you may find yourself in the IEBC first. In fact, I would, as I had said last week, look to the IEBC first, especially, well, specifically with existing buildings. And then as far as modifications and additions, that may eventually send you back to the IBC. But start there for existing conditions. And there were just a few things that I pointed out here. I think this is really kind of reiterating what he had may have already stated, but I wanted to just point out a few of the things that I've been finding as I'm combing through the Minnesota amendments, since some of these things were proposed, and some things that just because they are proposed are not necessarily going to find their way into the final version. And I'll give you an example of that shortly here. Okay, so another thing that came up that you may have been to the programs in the past. One of the things that we needed to address were the storm shelters. And there are some criteria that are involved in all that. Obviously, you see that here. Greater speeds 250, critical emergency operations, and K-12 are the two group occupancies that one needs to be aware of. It shows a map, but the good thing is that Greg and his group thought that it would be probably more pertinent that we list the counties. So that is in fact what you find within the Minnesota version of the IBC is specifically listing every single county rather than just relying on a map. So you'll find that criteria within 423 we'll talk about the items that are the criteria and the items and the elements and the assemblies that are required and what the performances are or prescriptive measures need to be to satisfy these kind of spaces. So know that you've got that to look at. And she's showing some provisions how one perceives these spaces, how to do it in a graphic sense here, but obviously it's important to make sure you have a safe space and from all things that are involved in a high winds incident as this. So it's really just kind of reiterating the things that are within the chapter within 423. But because this is a new provision that hadn't been addressed so specifically in the past, wanted to make sure that that folks were understanding that it existed, and then what is it going to take, or when are you going to be needing to address them. So it talks about the ladders, talks about the distances, mechanical ventilation, obviously going to be a big part of it too, and even toilet facilities. So these are all obviously things that need to be kept into play. I just added this as a reminder. Each section is, the section lists each applicable county for the critical emergency operation. And then we also have the schools, the K through 12s. A school, in this case, he's talking about existing schools. Certainly take a look at this at your leisure to see what those scenarios are. I won't belabor it or get into too much of the detail of it. And he's giving some examples of where one might be able to find, but it's all it's based on these thresholds. So if the building addition has got greater than 50 occupants, the addition, then you might find yourself looking at providing some sort of a safe haven shelter, within the existing structure. And then portables. What is involved if you're dealing with a portable condition, which we certainly have seen for those of us who are in, or in my case, used to be within the school market. That is something that you're going to have to take a look at. And it's all about the counts then too. If those counts are involved, where do you put it? How do you handle it? In another scenario, again, of portable classrooms and what one needs to address to meet this provision for a storm shelter. Talking more about really the same thing, locations, criteria. Okay, so the one thing that I had spent within the last few days, Greg and I were chatting about the session I was going to present today, and I'd asked him if there was anything within what I was going to show from his session, since that was still proposed at the time. And he brought up the firewalls. Now, the one takeaway I want you to understand with this, and this is why I put it in, it's a very minute change in the description. You can see the previous language. With whatever you're dealing with now, and everything behind that firewall is what it is, and that's how it goes. The IBC or the ICC came up with a clarification to what a firewall is intending to be. And basically what they're saying is it's for the purpose of determining area limitations, height limitations, and type of construction. Meaning, if that's how you're building a firewall, then you're good. But if you're building a firewall because there was no sprinkling behind that wall or in that building, and now you're adding a firewall to separate a sprinkled versus non-sprinklered, basically Doug Thornburg from the ICC clarified for me this last week that that's what's going away. What they've been finding is that firewalls were being put up for all situations, all variables that come into play in a building construction. And what the ICC has basically come back to and said, that's not the intent. The intent is to limit based on the area, height, and type of construction, period. Nothing else. So for those of you who have been using it in this term, in this way, nothing's changed. But if you're using it for other reasons, the building code has pretty much said that's not going to be the way you should be looking at it anymore. So the building officials should and will likely be following that criteria. Well, they should be following that criteria. So just keep that in mind as you're going forward, because firewalls, unlike area separation walls from the UBC days, they're not the same thing. Those, I'm sure most of you know that. They're structurally independent as opposed to the area separation walls. And there are certain things that you can consider, but typically, I don't know for the record or not, but what I've been told is that if you're looking at an old area separation wall and want to consider it in an existing construction, and then you're moving forward because you're looking at reanalyzing a building, and it's got old area separation walls, which are obviously not firewalls. There are things such as increase in area due to sprinkling may not be permitted and likely will not be permitted moving forward. So that has some challenges that come into play, because area due to sprinkling makes a big difference, as many of you know. So keep that in mind. Just know that the firewall has been tweaked or clarified in this code cycle. I just got into this. This was something I did a little presentation for my interiors group at HGA, and so I had added these things for that, and I thought, well, I might as well keep them into the document. but it's really just talking about the nuances and the things that are changing within the building code when it comes to finishes, and know that there are nuances, and be aware of them. And of course, take a look at section 803 to see what I'm referring to here. Same thing, decorative materials. What are the exceptions? Minnesota exceptions. There was a group A for combustible decorative materials. And there's fixed and movable walls and partitions, paneling, wall pads, and crash pads. And then Minnesota made an amendment to that specifically addresses some changes that we as a state thought was important. All right, so highlights of the IBC Chapter 9. I'm not going to belabor this one too much, but it's something that, obviously if you're in a mixed occupancy or multi-housing, this is something you want to keep tabs on. I'm sorry that it didn't get highlighted correctly, but it basically says an automatic sprinkler system shall be installed throughout all buildings with Group R fire area. Okay, so 903.3 talks about that. And really, yeah, talking about the firewalls as well to create separate buildings. Okay, so this is actually taking out some of the language. So take a look at that. Some of the provisions are there. There was some, I don't recall the specifics of this one as much. Here again, just to give everyone an understanding of the process, when we do the tag committees, we're going through every line item and spending the time we need to talk about what's pertinent, what isn't. And some of these things actually are not tabled, but there's other conversations happening as far as, does this relate to the fire code? Does this have any other mechanical aspects of the energy code? And so those tag committees are then meeting again, the chairs meet and look at the nuances and anything that's conflicting, and try to put some sort of a general understanding for consistency's sake, so that all the codes are not basically canceling each other out or providing conflict. So there's other meetings happening even after our tag committees took place that talk about what needs to be done to make sure there is no conflict within these the various chapters. And this gets back to what I've already talked about, but it's in fact, it's a very important item. Talking to Doug Thornburg, for those who don't know, Doug does a lot of code seminars for the ICC. He comes here at least once, if not twice a year, to either the Building Officials of Minnesota organization or through the U of M. And in those talks, he has mentioned this criteria to me as basically, as I said before, too many people were using it, or not too many people, but numerous areas of the country were using it for anything. And this is really just honing in and saying, this is what you can use it for and nothing else. Okay, so there's some exceptions involved with the sprinkling provision. And it's talking about that. So just know this, take a look at 903.28. If you're in this market and you're working within this building type. Voice alarms, there are some nuances that were put into the code to address some of these things. And Greg just wanted folks to know what those were. And it's prescriptive, so work within that, working with your likely your electrical or your technology group, be sure that they are on board with criteria that's here. And carbon monoxide detection, there's some ramping up that happened with that, and especially with the CO, the carbon monoxide, there's certain very specific criteria that we want to be able to be aware of. Okay, so number of exits and exits doorways. I'm gonna just do a quick view here about if anyone has. I've seen some chats coming up, but I'm not. They don't stay on my. I'll come back to that. Bear with me, and I'll just keep going through this, and then I'll circle back. Okay, so some of you have known about this thing with the boiler rooms and having the exits. There's nothing terribly unique about having two exits, 1/3 the length of the maximum overall diagonal. Usually, typically, that goes within a sprinkled space. There's something obviously that Greg wanted to get the group aware of, and just some of this is common sense. The one thing about mechanical rooms is, though, and he does talk about this here, is that second exit does not necessarily have to go through a door. You could find another path for it but it's specific for mechanical rooms. So give some examples here of how one approaches determining the exits within that space. And obviously he's got his bullet points of locate the axis to measure the diagonal, determine half the diagonal, verify exit axis separation. Those are the things that obviously are part of that process. And then your common paths and convergent paths. Obviously, you understand that if you have two exits that require common path of travel, it's not like they can get out of the room and then they converge. That would not be considered two exits. They need to diverge, and you have to find your path and how those all get played out. This is obviously talking about the same thing, but specifically for a boiler room. And then because of the sprinkling provision, he's allowing for the 1/3 diagonal and certainly the paths that go within that. And then making sure you don't have convergent paths. So this is a solution working with, for those who've worked within basement boiler rooms where you really have a hard time getting that second exit to occur. You do have an option here that you could use something like a ladder to be able to exit the space. And just making you aware of the in 10.06.221 talking about that. And specific exiting from vocational and science labs with hazmat. So we're getting into the occupancy, specifically K through 12, but then there are things involved such as hazardous materials and the size of the room for the labs and how one addresses the exiting from these spaces. Okay, so exit access is really getting into the same concept of common path of travel and exit access travel distance. Make sure you understand that they come from the same point, and they obviously common path stops after the space where the exit travel distance is measured all the way to an exit, whatever that designation may be. So and then some exceptions. You wanted to be aware of that. And there are some nuances here. So I think from this one here, it's really understanding what your sprinkler provision is, whether it's an Nfpa 13 or 13R. And specifically talking about the charts and the footnotes. Be aware that the footnotes are just as important as anything else, because they sometimes give you specific requirements, or they give you some exceptions. So be aware of that. And this is talking about the exit discharge. What is the exterior? Knowing that you need to get to the exterior, and talking about the single exit. So 10.06.332, item 2 will give you some parameters for that. And there are exceptions for a single exit, but you can go to the chart. There should be a specifically some items listed in the table that give you, the parameters depending on what the occupancy group is and what level you're on. So there's nuances to that. And here he's talking again about continuing to talk about the exiting, the specifics about the discharge directly to the exterior, access outside the discharge, and having 2 approved independent exits. Won't get into the detailing of this, but there are some nuances, and just be aware that it addresses that in 10.06.3.3. So the one thing that the code has also done is to clarify our interior exit stairwells. Because if you think about them, they are a higher level of protection. And frankly, I mean, if your common path of travel, your exit access travel distance can end at one of these enclosures, but only because they're higher level. 1 hour up to 4 stories, or 3 stories and 4 stories or more, 2-hour construction. But they also wanted to be sure that the design teams weren't penetrating these spaces with things that are not pertinent to the space itself. So really, this is what this list of items is talking about. What is considered an acceptable penetration and what isn't. So obviously these are things that all relate to the enclosure itself, and that gives you obviously some latitude based on what it is you're trying to do with that enclosure. So emergency escape and rescue openings, I'm not going to spend too much time with it. This somewhat has more to do with the residential, although the apartment buildings and so forth would obviously apply to this as well. And to know that there are certain provisions that are set up in 1030 that discuss the specifics. And then there's some exceptions. All about the ceiling height. It's emergency. Okay, so this specifically is talking about the the specific things that have to do with the egress. So know that you have some provisions that you need to be cognizant of and take action on. There again, depending on your occupancy group. And then some more to do with the sleeping room. So these are nuances that need to be addressed, but depending on how that use is defined, because obviously the sleeping room is going to trigger a few more things than a living space. And this will discuss that. And I think there were some exceptions that were moved around a little bit here, and he's trying to point out some of those criteria and how they've been adjusted to work with the newest code cycle. More to do with the exceptions, where they're located, how they're addressed. And again, more of that for those who are in that market. I haven't been too much involved within these kind of project types. There are others that are on the line who are certainly more understanding of the nuances to this and what the provisions of these, what it means for providing an effective egress and escape route. And then high-rise buildings, I think these are, again, exceptions that have been moved around. Take a look. Get familiar with 1030, since there are obviously a few things that have changed, whether by Minnesota amendment or prior to, let's say, from the 2015, which of course we didn't adopt. Be aware that those are there and they need to be thought through. Okay, and then there were some repeals. Let's see, it's really just take a look at it. I won't, again, it's not my area of common use, so I'm not as familiar with some of these things, but obviously there are changes that have occurred, and you need to be aware of them. So we did talk about this a little bit too. So the thing with window replacement is because we have this window fall protection. And so there was a whole litany of conversations that happened with various manufacturers. We have a few in our area, in the state, who chimed in, and we welcome their input, because it's one thing to make something in the code, but then to make sure that the manufacturers are on board with you. So what comes first. So we wanted to make sure that there were provisions that allowed for escape, but then you still have to work with the fire department and make it so that it's possible that you can get access into as well as egress out. And also fall protection. You want to make sure that you have the right kind of hardware and applications within your windows so that you have, you can accommodate the code. And then there again, in this case, because it's residential, there are provisions based on the 13R versus the 13. So get familiar with that. So these are some scenarios. He's giving a scenario here: central stair, one front door. Not sure what that one went to, but there are some provisions for that as well. Okay, and the last thing, we got a few more minutes left here, so I'll try to get through this yet, and maybe some time for some Q&A. So the plumbing changes. So 2902.1, no longer required in adult child care. Bathing fixtures are no longer allowed, required. And I don't think it's saying so much about an exception. It may just be basically not addressed as a criteria. But take a look at the table, because if you go to it now, you will find that it is basically a big bar around the entire table with Minnesota added in the margin. So you need to be sure that whatever you knew from the old table 29 from the 2012 version, that any criteria is either changed or amended to accommodate certain occupancy groups, because we have a few more occupancy groups. But just get familiar with the table itself, the new table or the revised table, as it were. But this is the one that basically is going to give you your toilet counts. And hot topic. I mean, this can take. We did this in our building codes group, and I think we spent the entire hour talking about one specific thing, and I don't think we actually came to a resolvement. But as it is, based on how the various codes and the references, the UPC, as well as Nfpa, there are things within those codes that have now basically said that if you want a toilet facility, it includes a toilet and a sink, as opposed to just a toilet and the sinks are in the public area. So we're actually taking that language from the other codes and addressing it that way. This has more to do with the definition and how one addresses it. So basically, I put in single user toilet facilities and bathing rooms, and family or assisted use toilet rooms and bathing rooms shall be identified for use by either sex. That is no longer allowed to be signed for exclusive use by men or women. So that's a provision that's currently in the code. So definitely pay attention to that one. And then he's talking about the structured tenant space with less than 25. When do you have toilet facilities, or can you go with just one toilet facility? And there's provisions for that in 2902.2. Just talks more about that, and depending on, and then there's exceptions, of course. There's always exceptions, and this is telling you about those exceptions. Okay, and HVAC and elevator hoistways. There again, this is where about the shafts, and one has to be cognizant of the shafts, and protecting them from anything that is not related to the shaft. Elevator lobbies, talking about spaces, you can look at that criteria. More to do with elevator lobbies. And I'm running out of time, so I want to kind of get through that. But let me see if I can get to chat here. Okay. All right. So I think we're getting, let's see. Will plan review policy PR04 that provides a structurally stability exception for firewalls in existing buildings still be applicable? That is a good question. So the public policies, they try to rope those in, and we've certainly talked about that when Greg and I and Jerry and others met in our tag committees and saying, what about these policies from the past? Can we somehow find a way to bring them into the code? I don't have the answer to this at this time. It's a good question though. generally speaking, if you're looking at, if you're talking about, and it sounds like you're talking about an area separation wall, then it's the code in certain jurisdictions have said to me, you can do that. You can assume the area separation walls is being used to divide your buildings, but you don't get to use the sprinkler for area increase. So in other words, they're giving take. We're giving from the fact that a area separation wall is not as well, it's not structurally independent. Generally speaking, they weren't built that way, and maybe they were, but that's something you certainly should take a look at, and know that you may not get the added benefit of the sprinkling for area increase, which definitely can be a challenge for certain building types and building projects. All right, clustering single-use toilet rooms instead of providing multi-user facilities. Are single-user toilet room dimensions accessible? Is there a standard toilet room and cluster concept? That's for another day, I think. But there are various groups out there that I've shared with in our building code committee who have actually created documents that talk about these provisions and how one might be able to approach it with a building official. Because like it or not, I mean, you have to work within the code, but there are obviously, as code is not black and white as we'd like to think it is, but it isn't, to be able to address some of these things with a building official to make sure that you're all on the same page as far as how you're addressing the criteria that you're showing or the layout that you're showing. We have a situation where we are required to provide separate facilities for each sex, but only provide 3 single occupant toilet rooms. Can we assign one for men, one for women, and one for all gender? Well, apparently, according to this code provision, you can't. I mean, it's pretty much like they're all gender, but you can accommodate, you can assign for one and the other as a toilet count is concerned. Certainly can do that, but the signage may not be to the point where you're designated as men and women. There again, take a look at the code, to be sure that it's clear to you of the approach that you should be taking. And I think that's all I had from the group session. We are over time, so sorry to extend this any further than necessary, but just know that this is available. It is being taped. It is available, and if you like to see I made some tweaks since what Deanna sent out. If you want to see an updated with some of the other notes that I took, please reach out to Deanna, and she'd be more than happy to send those to you.
Hey, Gerhard.
Yes.
They don't need to reach out to me. I will just automatically send the updated version to everyone.
Very good. You heard it from her.
And thank you again, Gerhard. Appreciate your lending your expertise and your time here. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, you're very welcome. And stay tuned. Next week will be the Karen Gridley version, well, my version of Karen Gridley's presentation that she gave on ADA.
Very
so
good.
1341.